Lightning cracked across the sky, and the truck skidded on the wet gravel road. Daniel gripped the wheel with both hands, his heart pounding as the storm tore through the mountain pass. In the back of the truck, under a canvas cover, his dog Sable began to bark and scratch at the wood panel. She was due to have puppies any day now, and the thunder was terrifying her. Daniel pulled over as fast as he safely could, his tires sliding through mud. He jumped out into the rain, calling her name, but the moment he lifted the canvas cover, Sable leaped down and bolted into the trees. She was gone before he could even reach for her collar. "Sable, Sable, come back," he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind and rain. He ran after her, following the sound of her paws crashing through the underbrush, but within seconds, she had vanished into the thick, dark forest. The rain came down harder, blurring his vision, and soon he could not tell which direction she had gone. For the next 3 hours, Daniel searched every trail near the road, shouting her name, until his throat felt raw. He used his truck lights to scan the trees, hoping to see her eyes reflecting back at him, but there was nothing, only rain, wind, and the endless black shapes of pine trees swaying in the storm. By midnight, exhausted and soaked to the bone, Daniel had no choice but to return to the logging camp where he worked. He sat in his truck outside his cabin, staring at the empty passenger seat where Sable usually rode. She had been his companion for 4 years, ever since he adopted her as a small puppy from a farm 2 counties over. She was gentle, loyal, and smarter than most people gave dogs credit for. And now she was out there alone, pregnant, in a storm that showed no sign of stopping. The next morning, Daniel organized a search with a few of the other loggers. Henry, a broad-shouldered man who had worked with Daniel for years, offered to help without hesitation. "She can't have gone too far," Henry said, tightening the straps on his boots. "Dogs are smart. She probably found some shelter." They spent the whole day walking the ridges and valleys near where Sable had disappeared. They called her name until their voices grew hoarse. They checked culverts, hollow logs, and the edges of the creek that ran through the valley, but there was no sign of her. Not a paw print, not a torn piece of fur caught on a branch, nothing. By the 3rd day, the search area had grown to nearly 10 miles in every direction, but still nothing turned up. The forest was vast, filled with steep ravines, thick brush, and old logging roads that had not been used in decades. Henry tried to reassure Daniel, but even he began to sound less certain with each passing hour. "Storms like that can carry a scent for miles," Henry said quietly on the 4th evening, as they sat around a small fire near the camp. "She could be anywhere by now." Daniel did not answer. He simply stared into the flames, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. If only he had checked the canvas cover more carefully. If only he had pulled over sooner. If only he had known how much that storm would frighten her. On the 5th day, the camp foreman gently suggested that continuing the search was taking too much time away from the work crew's schedule. Daniel understood, but it still felt like giving up. He spent one more day searching alone, walking further than anyone else had gone, calling her name into canyons that echoed back only silence. That night, sitting on the steps of his cabin, Daniel allowed himself to accept the painful truth. Sable was gone. Whether she had gotten lost, injured, or worse, there was no way to know. All he could do now was hope that, somewhere out there, she had found safety. Weeks passed, and though Daniel returned to his work, a part of him never stopped watching the tree line whenever he drove past the area where she disappeared. Some evenings he would slow the truck down, half expecting to see her trotting out from between the trees, tail wagging, as if nothing had happened, but she never appeared. Meanwhile, deep within that same forest, far beyond where any of the search parties had walked, a small wooden cabin stood quietly beside a stream. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, and inside lived a woman named Ruth. She was in her 60s, with silver hair she kept pulled back in a loose braid, and she had chosen this remote life many years earlier, after losing her husband and her only son within the same difficult year. She found peace in solitude, tending a small garden, chopping her own firewood, and reading old books by lamplight. Ruth rarely saw another person. The nearest town, a small place called Fallbrook, was nearly 2 days' walk away, and she only made the trip a few times a year to trade goods and pick up supplies. She had grown used to the quiet, and in many ways, she preferred it. The forest asked nothing of her except patience and respect, and in return, it gave her peace. On the night of the storm, Ruth had been sitting by her fireplace, mending an old quilt, when she heard something scratching weakly at her door. At first, she thought it might be a raccoon or a fox looking for shelter from the rain. But when she opened the door, lantern raised, she found something she had not expected. A large dog lay collapsed on her porch, soaked through, shivering, and clearly exhausted. Her sides were heaving with each breath, and Ruth could see immediately that the poor animal was heavily pregnant. Mud clung to her fur, and one of her paws looked scraped and tender, likely from running over rocky ground. Ruth knelt down slowly, speaking in a soft, calm voice. "Well now, where did you come from?" she asked gently, extending her hand for the dog to smell. The dog, too tired to be afraid, simply rested her head against Ruth's palm. Without hesitation, Ruth helped the exhausted animal inside, laying an old blanket by the fire. She brought a bowl of water, which the dog drank eagerly, and then some warm broth left over from her dinner. The dog ate slowly, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the door, as if she were still listening for the storm, or perhaps for someone calling her name. That night, Ruth stayed awake beside the fire, watching over her unexpected guest. She had no idea that miles away, a man named Daniel was searching desperately through the rain, calling out for the very dog now resting safely by her hearth. The dog did not have a collar, or if she once had, it must have slipped off somewhere in the chaos of her escape. Ruth had no way of knowing her name, so for now, she simply called her Girl, speaking softly whenever the dog stirred in her sleep. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest calm and dripping with fresh rain. Sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, and birds began to sing again in the trees outside. Ruth opened her door to let in the fresh air, glancing down at the dog still curled by the fireplace. The animal lifted her head, looking at Ruth with tired but grateful eyes. "You're safe now," Ruth said softly, kneeling to stroke her damp fur. "Whatever happened out there, you don't have to be afraid anymore." Ruth examined the dog carefully in the daylight. She appeared to be a mixed breed, strong and well-built, likely used for hunting or farm work given her muscular frame. Her belly was clearly swollen with puppies that could arrive any day. Ruth had raised farm animals before, including a few litters of puppies decades earlier, so she recognized the signs immediately. She spent that day preparing a warm, dry space in the small barn behind her cabin, laying down clean straw and old blankets. She moved slowly and carefully, allowing the dog to follow her at her own pace, sniffing every corner of the space, before finally settling down with a contented sigh. Ruth sat beside her for a long while that afternoon, watching the dog rest peacefully for the first time since arriving. She wondered, not for the first time, whether this animal had a family somewhere searching for her, but the nearest neighbors were miles away, and Ruth had heard nothing about a missing dog on her last visit to town, weeks earlier. For now, all she could do was care for the animal in front of her, and hope that whoever the dog belonged to would understand, wherever they were, that she was being looked after with kindness. As night fell again, Ruth banked the fire low and settled into her rocking chair with a cup of tea, listening to the steady, calm breathing of the dog resting nearby. Outside, the forest had grown quiet once more, the storm nothing but a memory carried away on the wind. But somewhere far beyond the tree line, a man named Daniel lay awake in his cabin, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever see his dog again. Neither of them could have known, on that quiet night, just how long it would be before their paths crossed again, or how much would change in the years between. Back at the logging camp, life slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though something had clearly shifted in Daniel. He worked hard during the day, hauling timber and repairing equipment, but his evenings grew quieter. He no longer whistled while he worked, and he stopped leaving the truck window open, just in case Sable came trotting back. Henry noticed the change, and tried, in his own rough way, to offer comfort. "You did everything you could," he said one evening, as they repaired a broken chainsaw together. "Sometimes the woods just keep their secrets." Daniel nodded, though the words did little to ease the ache in his chest. He had grown up with dogs his whole life, but none had been quite like Sable. She had a way of sensing his moods, resting her head on his knee whenever he seemed tired or discouraged, and following him everywhere, without ever needing to be told. A month after the storm, Daniel drove into Fallbrook to pick up supplies for the camp. While there, he stopped by the small general store run by a woman named Laura, who had lived in the area her whole life and knew almost everyone who passed through. "Any luck finding your dog?" Laura asked, noticing the tired look in his eyes. Daniel shook his head. Nothing. It's like she disappeared into thin air. Laura frowned thoughtfully. That storm was a bad one. Strange things happen in these mountains during weather like that. Animals get turned around, lose their sense of direction. But dogs are survivors. If she found shelter somewhere, she could still be out there. Daniel wanted to believe her, but as the weeks turned into months, that hope grew harder to hold on to. Eventually, the search faded from conversation entirely, replaced by the demands of daily work and the slow passage of time. Yet even as autumn turned to winter, and winter melted into spring, Daniel never fully let go of the thought that somewhere, deep in those endless trees, Sable might still be alive. He could not have imagined that, at that very moment, in a small clearing far beyond the reach of any search party, 5 new lives were about to begin. A few days after Sable arrived at the cabin, Ruth noticed the dog becoming restless. She paced around the barn, scratching at the straw and refusing to settle in one spot for long. Ruth recognized the signs at once. The puppies were coming. She stayed close through the night, keeping a lantern lit and fresh water within reach. Sable worked quietly through the hours before dawn, and by the time the first light crept through the cracks in the barn wall, 5 small puppies lay nestled against their mother, each one blind, damp, and impossibly small. Ruth watched in quiet amazement as Sable cleaned each puppy carefully, nudging them gently toward her side to nurse. There were 3 females and 2 males, their coats a mix of dark brown and black, much like their mothers. Ruth had cared for litters of puppies before, many years earlier, but there was something different about this moment. Perhaps it was the isolation of her life, or the years of quiet solitude, but watching this small family begin its life in her barn stirred something in her that she had not felt in a long time. "You did well," Ruth whispered to Sable, stroking her head gently. "You did so well." Over the following days, Ruth fell into a new rhythm. She checked on the puppies morning and night, making sure they stayed warm, and that Sable had enough food and water to keep up her strength. She began setting snares for rabbits and gathering extra fish from the stream, knowing that a nursing mother needed far more nourishment than she typically prepared for herself alone. It was hard work, but Ruth found herself looking forward to it in a way she had not expected. For years, her days had followed the same quiet pattern, waking alone, tending her garden alone, eating alone. Now, for the first time in a long while, her mornings began with the soft sound of tiny puppies squeaking for their mother's attention, and she found herself smiling before she had even left her bed. She thought often about where Sable might have come from. The dog's behavior suggested she had been well cared for at some point. She responded to gentle words, seemed comfortable around people, and had clearly been fed regularly before ending up lost in the storm. Ruth guessed she must have belonged to someone, perhaps a farmer or hunter working somewhere in the surrounding hills, but with no way to search for an owner, and no visitors passing through, there was little she could do, except continue caring for the little family that had found its way to her. As the puppies grew stronger, their eyes opened, revealing curious, dark eyes that followed every movement in the barn. Ruth spent hours simply sitting and watching them tumble over one another, yipping and play fighting, as they explored their small wooden world. She began to give them names, though she reminded herself often that they were not truly hers to keep. The largest of the males, dark and sturdy, she called Birch, after the trees that lined the stream near her cabin. The smallest female, timid but clever, she named Wren, for the small bird that often sang outside her window each morning. The other 3 she called Fern, Moss, and Clay, each name drawn from the quiet, natural world that surrounded her home. Sable watched over her puppies constantly, but she also began following Ruth around the small homestead, as though she understood that this woman had saved both her life and the lives of her children. She would sit beside Ruth while she worked in the garden, rest her head against her leg while she read by the fire, and follow closely whenever Ruth walked down to the stream to collect water. Ruth had lived alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed by another living creature. But now, each day brought new small reminders of purpose. She found herself talking more, humming quiet tunes while she worked, and even laughing softly at the puppies' clumsy attempts to climb over one another. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch watching the puppies play in a patch of sunlight, Ruth allowed herself to think about the years before she came to the forest. She had once lived a very different life, in a small house near the edge of town, with a husband who loved to tell stories by the fire, and a son who dreamed of becoming a forest ranger. Both had been taken from her within the same difficult year, one through illness, the other through an accident no one could have prevented. The grief had been so overwhelming that she had chosen to leave everything behind and disappear into the quiet of the mountains, believing that solitude was the only way she could survive the pain. For years, that had been true. The forest had given her the space to breathe, to grieve quietly, without the weight of others' sympathy pressing down on her. But sitting there, watching Sable and her puppies enjoy the warm afternoon sun, Ruth realized that solitude had slowly become something heavier than peace. It had become loneliness, wrapped in the comfortable disguise of quiet. She looked down at Wren, the smallest puppy, who had wandered over and curled up against her foot, already fast asleep. Ruth reached down and gently stroked her soft fur. "Maybe you were sent to remind me of something," she said quietly, more to herself than to the sleeping puppy. "Maybe I forgot how to let anyone in." As the weeks passed, the puppies grew steadily stronger, their wobbly legs becoming sturdy enough to explore beyond the barn. Ruth built a small fence around part of her garden to keep them from wandering too far, though Birch, the boldest of the litter, often found ways to slip through the gaps and investigate the edges of the clearing. Sable remained watchful but relaxed, trusting Ruth completely with the care of her young family. In the evenings, the entire group would gather near the fireplace, puppies tumbling over each other in exhausted piles, while Sable rested nearby, keeping one eye open in quiet vigilance. Ruth often thought about what would happen when the puppies grew older. She knew that eventually, they would need more space to run, more structure to their training, and perhaps even homes of their own, if she ever found a way to connect with people beyond the forest. But for now, she allowed herself simply to enjoy each day as it came, grateful for the unexpected family that had transformed her quiet life. Little did she know that miles away, a man who had once called Sable his own, had not stopped thinking about her, even as the seasons continued to change. Spring turned to summer, and the small clearing around Ruth's cabin transformed with the season. Wildflowers bloomed along the edges of the garden, and the stream that once ran cold and fast with melting snow settled into a gentle, steady flow. The puppies, no longer tiny and wobbling, had grown into strong, playful young dogs, each one developing a personality of their own. Birch remained the boldest of the group, always the first to investigate strange sounds or chase after birds that landed too close to the garden. Wren stayed close to Ruth's side most days, calm and watchful, often the first to notice when something was wrong. Fern and Moss had grown into a nearly inseparable pair, always play fighting or racing each other across the clearing, while Clay, quieter than the rest, preferred to sit near the stream, watching the water for hours. Ruth had settled into a new rhythm of life that revolved entirely around her canine family. Each morning began with feeding the dogs, checking for any injuries from their nighttime adventures, and then tending to her garden while they played nearby. In the afternoons, she would often walk with them along the familiar trails near her home, teaching them gradually to follow her voice, to stay close when she called, and to avoid wandering too far into the deeper parts of the forest, where wild animals sometimes roamed. It was demanding work for a woman her age, but Ruth found she had more energy than she had felt in years. The dogs gave her a reason to rise early, to stay active, and to engage with the world around her in a way she had avoided since her husband and son had passed. She began talking to them constantly, narrating her days as though they could understand every word, and in many ways, she believed they did. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the edge of the clearing, Ruth heard Wren let out a sharp, urgent bark. She turned quickly to see the young dog standing rigid, staring toward a fallen tree a short distance away. Ruth approached carefully and discovered a young fox caught in an old rusted trap, likely set years earlier by a previous occupant of the land and long forgotten. The fox snarled weakly, exhausted from its struggle, but Ruth approached slowly, speaking in the same calm voice she used with her dogs. It took nearly half an hour of patient effort, but she managed to release the trap without injury to herself or further harm to the frightened animal. The fox limped away into the trees, disappearing quickly from sight. That evening, as she cleaned the rust from her hands, Ruth reflected on how much her instincts had sharpened since the dogs had entered her life. She moved more confidently through the forest now, aware of sounds and signs she might have overlooked before. The dogs had not just given her companionship, they had given her purpose and awareness, sharpening her connection to the land she called home. As summer deepened, Ruth noticed that her small food stores were being tested more than usual. 5 grown dogs required significant food, far more than she alone could provide through foraging and fishing. She began spending extra hours each week, setting snares for rabbits and squirrels, and she expanded her garden considerably, planting more vegetables than she had grown in years. Despite the extra work, Ruth never resented the effort. Watching Birch and Clay wrestle playfully near the stream, or seeing Wren curl up loyally beside her chair each evening, reminded her constantly of why she had chosen this path. The dogs asked for nothing but food, shelter, and companionship, and in return, they filled her days with warmth and purpose she had not known she was missing. One particularly warm afternoon, Ruth decided to take the entire group on a longer walk than usual, following an old trail that led toward a ridge overlooking a distant valley. The dogs ran ahead excitedly, exploring new scents and sounds, while Ruth followed at her own steady pace, enjoying the warmth of the sun through the trees. At the top of the ridge, she paused to catch her breath, looking out over the vast expanse of forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, she knew, lay towns and roads and the busy lives of people she had left behind years earlier. But standing there, surrounded by her small pack of loyal dogs, Ruth felt no pull to return to that world. She had built something quiet and meaningful here, something she had never expected to find again. As the dogs continued growing through the following months, Ruth began teaching them simple commands, more out of necessity than ambition. She needed them to stay close during storms, to avoid wandering too far when hunting parties occasionally passed through the distant hills, and to remain calm around the few wild animals they encountered on their walks. Sable, older and wiser than her offspring, seemed to understand instinctively what Ruth was trying to accomplish, often demonstrating the desired behavior herself, until the younger dogs followed her lead. It was as though Sable had appointed herself Ruth's assistant in raising the pack, gently guiding her puppies toward the behaviors their new caretaker hoped to instill. By the time autumn arrived again, painting the forest in shades of gold and deep red, the dogs had grown into a confident, well-behaved pack, each one uniquely bonded to Ruth in their own way. She could not have imagined, just a year earlier, how completely her quiet, solitary life would transform. Yet even amid this newfound joy, Ruth occasionally found herself thinking about where Sable had come from, and whether someone out there still wondered what had happened to her. She had no way of knowing that, in a logging camp many miles away, a man named Daniel still glanced toward the tree line every time he drove past the spot where his dog had disappeared, holding on to a hope he could not quite explain, even to himself. The second winter in the forest tested Ruth in ways she had not experienced since first arriving at her cabin many years earlier. Snow fell heavily that year, burying the trails and turning the short walk to the stream into a difficult trek through waist-deep drifts. Yet even in the harshest weather, the dogs remained a source of comfort and companionship, curling up close to the fire each night, their combined warmth helping to fight off the deep chill that crept through the cabin walls. Ruth had grown noticeably more tired as the season wore on, though she tried her best not to dwell on it. She attributed the fatigue to age, to the physical demands of caring for a growing pack of dogs, and to the long, difficult winters that had always been part of life in the mountains. Still, there were mornings when rising from bed took more effort than it once had, and afternoons when she found herself resting longer than usual by the fire. Wren seemed to notice these changes before anyone else. The young dog had grown into a remarkably perceptive animal, often resting her head on Ruth's lap during these tired afternoons, staying close in a way that felt more protective than simply affectionate. Ruth appreciated the quiet company, though she never spoke aloud about the growing weariness she sometimes felt deep in her bones. Despite the physical challenges, Ruth continued her daily routines with determination. She kept the woodpile stocked, the dogs fed, and the small cabin as warm and welcoming as she could manage. The forest around her remained silent and still through much of the winter, broken only by the occasional howl of distant wolves or the creaking of snow-laden branches under the weight of another storm. One particularly cold night, a fierce blizzard swept through the region, rattling the cabin windows and piling snow high against the door. Ruth kept the fire burning steadily. The dogs gathered close around her chair, their presence a comfort against the howling wind outside. She read quietly by lamplight, occasionally glancing toward Sable, who now showed the first gentle signs of gray fur appearing around her muzzle. "You've grown old with me, haven't you?" Ruth said softly, reaching down to stroke the aging dog's head. Sable responded with a soft, contented sigh, resting her chin against Ruth's knee. As winter finally loosened its grip and the first signs of spring began appearing once more, the pack resumed their daily explorations of the surrounding forest. The dogs had grown remarkably skilled at navigating the terrain, often alerting Ruth to changes in weather or the presence of other animals, long before she noticed anything herself. Birch, now fully grown and confident, had taken on an almost protective role within the group, positioning himself near the front whenever they explored unfamiliar areas. It was during one of these spring walks that Ruth first noticed a sharp, unfamiliar pain in her chest. She paused, resting a hand against a nearby tree, waiting for the discomfort to pass. The dogs immediately gathered around her, sensing something was wrong, Wren pressing gently against her leg, while Clay let out a low, worried whine. After a few minutes, the pain subsided, and Ruth continued the walk, dismissing the incident as simple fatigue, or perhaps something she had eaten. She mentioned it to no one, of course, for there was no one nearby to mention it to. She made a private note to rest more often, and to take the steep sections of trail more slowly in the future. Over the following weeks, similar moments occurred with slightly increasing frequency, though Ruth continued to attribute them to age and the physical demands of her lifestyle. She adjusted her routines accordingly, allowing the dogs to range further on their own during shorter walks, while she rested more at the cabin, tending her garden at a gentler pace. Despite these subtle changes, Ruth's bond with her canine family only continued to deepen. She had grown to understand each dog's individual personality intimately, recognizing Wren's quiet perceptiveness, Birch's protective confidence, Fern and Moss's playful energy, and Clay's calm, thoughtful nature. Sable, meanwhile, had settled into a role of quiet wisdom, gently guiding her grown puppies, while remaining Ruth's closest companion through every season. One warm afternoon in early summer, Ruth sat on her porch, watching the pack play near the garden, their movements confident and joyful in the golden afternoon light. She found herself thinking, not for the first time, about what might happen to them if her own health continued to decline. The thought troubled her deeply, though she pushed it aside as she often did, choosing instead to focus on the simple joy of the present moment. She began, quietly and without drawing attention to her intentions, teaching the dogs additional skills beyond basic obedience. She taught them to hunt small game more effectively, to recognize the boundaries of safe territory, and to work together as a cohesive group when facing potential threats from larger predators. She could not fully explain, even to herself, why she felt such urgency in ensuring their independence, though some quiet instinct told her it was important. The dogs absorbed these lessons eagerly, their natural intelligence and strong family bond making them remarkably capable students. Sable, despite her aging body, continued to demonstrate patience and leadership, ensuring her offspring understood every lesson Ruth attempted to teach. As the second summer in the forest reached its peak, Ruth found herself reflecting often on the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken. She had come to these mountains seeking escape from unbearable grief, expecting to live out her remaining years in quiet solitude. Instead, she had found herself surrounded by a loyal, loving family of dogs who filled her days with purpose, laughter, and a companionship she had never anticipated finding again. Yet even as she cherished every moment with her canine family, a quiet worry continued growing in the back of her mind, one she chose not to examine too closely, preferring instead to focus on the joy of each present day, rather than the uncertainty that might lie ahead. By the time the second autumn arrived in the forest, the pack had grown into their full adult strength, each dog now standing tall and confident, their coats thick and healthy from years of careful care. Ruth had settled into a quieter version of her daily routine, allowing the dogs more independence while she conserved her own energy for the tasks that mattered most. She had started keeping a small journal, something she had never done before, recording simple observations about the dog's behavior, the changing seasons, and occasional thoughts about her own health. It was not something she intended for anyone else to read, but rather a quiet way of processing the changes she felt happening within her own body, changes she still refused to name aloud. The chest pains had become slightly more frequent, though never severe enough to truly frighten her. She had experienced enough of life's hardships to recognize the signs of a body slowing down, and in her private moments, she suspected her heart was simply tired, worn down by years of grief, hard work, and the physical demands of mountain living. She made no plans to seek help, knowing the nearest town was too far for her to reach easily on her own, and having long since made peace with the idea that her life, however it ended, would end here, in these mountains she had grown to love. Despite this quiet acceptance, Ruth found herself more determined than ever to prepare her canine family for whatever the future might hold. She spent hours each week reinforcing their hunting skills, teaching them to work together when tracking game, and ensuring each dog understood how to navigate safely through the varied terrain surrounding their home. Birch had grown into a natural leader among the group, often taking charge during hunts, and confidently guiding his siblings through unfamiliar sections of the forest. Wren remained Ruth's closest companion, rarely straying far from her side, her perceptive nature seeming to grow sharper with each passing month. Fern and Moss continued their playful partnership, though they had also developed impressive skills working together to flush small game from dense underbrush. Clay, always the quietest of the group, had become remarkably skilled at patiently waiting near the stream, catching fish with a precision that surprised even Ruth. Sable, now noticeably gray around her muzzle and moving with the careful deliberation of an aging dog, remained the emotional center of the pack. Despite her slower pace, she continued to oversee her grown puppies with quiet authority, occasionally correcting overly rough play or guiding the group toward safer paths during their explorations. One crisp October morning, Ruth experienced her most severe episode yet. She had been carrying water from the stream when a sudden, crushing pain gripped her chest, forcing her to drop the buckets and lower herself carefully to the ground. The pain lasted several long minutes, during which Wren stayed pressed tightly against her side, whimpering softly, while the other dogs gathered protectively around her, their usual playful energy replaced by quiet concern. When the pain finally subsided, Ruth remained seated on the cold ground for a long while, catching her breath and steadying her racing heart. She looked around at the concerned faces of her canine family, each one watching her with worried, attentive eyes. "I'm all right," she said softly, though her voice carried less certainty than she intended, just an old woman's heart being difficult. That evening, sitting by the fire with the dogs gathered close, Ruth allowed herself, for the first time, to truly consider what might happen if she were no longer able to care for them. She thought about writing a letter, something she could leave behind, that might eventually lead someone to find and care for the pack, should anything happen to her. But the nearest neighbors were miles away, and she had no reliable way to ensure such a letter would ever be found or read by the right person. Instead, she made a quiet decision to focus her remaining energy on ensuring the dog's complete independence. She began deliberately stepping back from certain daily tasks, allowing Birch and his siblings to hunt and forage more extensively on their own, ensuring that even without her guidance, they would be capable of surviving comfortably within the forest they had grown to know so well. The dogs adapted quickly to this shift, their confidence and capability growing with each passing week. Ruth watched with a mixture of pride and quiet sorrow, as her canine family demonstrated increasing self-sufficiency, understanding on some deep level that she was preparing them for a future she might not be part of. Despite the physical toll her declining health continued to take, Ruth refused to let sadness overshadow the joy she still found in each day. She continued reading by the fire each evening, tending her garden during the cooler morning hours, and taking shorter, gentler walks with her dogs whenever her strength allowed. She cherished every moment of playful energy from Fern and Moss, every quiet, loyal presence from Wren, every confident glance from Birch, and every patient, watchful moment shared with Clay near the stream. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the familiar challenges of deep snow and biting cold, Ruth found herself grateful, above all else, for the unexpected family that had transformed her final years from quiet isolation into a life filled with purpose, companionship, and unconditional love. Whatever time she had remaining, she intended to spend it fully present with the pack that had given her life new meaning, even as she quietly continued preparing them for the day she would no longer be there to guide them. 2 years had now passed since the storm that separated Daniel from Sable, and life at the logging camp had settled into a steady, familiar rhythm. Daniel had taken on more responsibility over time, eventually becoming a crew leader overseeing a small team of workers. He had gotten another dog, a young energetic hound named Scout, though he often admitted quietly to Henry that Scout, as wonderful as he was, could never quite fill the space Sable had left behind. Henry had grown into one of Daniel's closest friends over the years, the the two of them sharing countless evenings around the campfire discussing everything from work troubles to old memories. Henry never forgot the storm that had taken Sable, and he occasionally brought up the topic gently, curious whether Daniel had ever truly made peace with the loss. "You still think about her," Henry said one evening, not really a question. Daniel nodded, staring into the fire. "Every time I drive past that stretch of road, I know it's foolish after all this time, but I can't help it." Henry didn't try to argue or offer easy reassurance. He simply nodded, understanding the quiet weight some losses carried, regardless of how much time passed. Life in Fallbrook, meanwhile, continued its own steady rhythm. Laura's general store remained a hub of local gossip and news, and it was there, one late spring afternoon, that Daniel first heard something that would change everything. A young hiker named Peter had wandered into the store, exhausted and slightly disheveled after several days, exploring a remote section of the forest few locals ever ventured into. He was recounting his adventure to Laura, describing a beautiful, isolated valley he had stumbled upon, when he mentioned something that immediately caught Daniel's attention. "Strangest thing," Peter said, sipping the water Laura had offered him. "I saw a pack of dogs out there, 5 or 6 of them, running together like a family. Healthy-looking animals, too, not like the wild strays you sometimes hear about. One of them, an older female, looked like she might have been someone's pet once." Daniel, who had been quietly browsing the store shelves, turned sharply toward the conversation. "What did they look like exactly?" he asked, his voice carrying more urgency than he intended. Peter shrugged, slightly surprised by the sudden interest. "Dark coats, mostly. The older one had some gray around her face. Strong, healthy dogs, though, moved together like they'd been trained, almost like they had a leader." Daniel's heart began pounding as memories of that stormy night flooded back. He asked Peter several more questions, learning as much as he could about the exact location where the young hiker had spotted the pack. Peter, though uncertain of precise directions, described a remote valley several days' hike beyond the usual logging trails, near an old homestead that had supposedly been abandoned decades earlier. That night, Daniel could hardly sleep. He replayed the conversation over and over in his mind, trying to convince himself that it was likely just an ordinary pack of wild dogs, unrelated to Sable in any way. Yet something about Peter's description, particularly the mention of an older female with graying fur moving confidently at the front of a coordinated group, refused to leave his thoughts. The following morning, Daniel sought out Peter again before the young hiker left town, asking him to draw as detailed a map as he could remember of the route he had taken. Peter, sensing the importance of the request, took his time sketching out landmarks, creek crossings, and rough distances as best he could recall. Armed with this rough map, Daniel spent the next several days quietly preparing for an expedition of his own. He gathered supplies, arranged time away from his crew leadership duties, and informed Henry of his plans, half expecting his friend to discourage such an uncertain, potentially dangerous journey into unfamiliar territory. Instead, Henry simply nodded, understanding immediately what this opportunity meant to his old friend. "You want company?" he asked simply. Daniel considered the offer for a moment before shaking his head. "I appreciate it, but this is something I need to do on my own." 2 days later, Daniel set out early in the morning, following Peter's hand-drawn map deep into unfamiliar forest terrain. The journey proved more difficult than he anticipated, the trails growing fainter and less defined with each passing mile, forcing him to rely heavily on Peter's rough landmarks and his own careful navigation skills honed through years of logging work. By the end of the first day, exhausted and uncertain whether he was even following the correct path, Daniel made camp beside a small creek, staring up at the star-filled sky and wondering whether this journey was nothing more than a foolish, hopeful mistake. Yet even amid his doubts, something deep within him refused to turn back, a quiet, persistent instinct that felt stronger than mere hope. The following morning, Daniel continued deeper into the forest, following the increasingly faint markers Peter had described. The terrain grew steeper and more remote, thick underbrush and fallen trees making progress slow and difficult. Just as doubt began creeping heavily into his thoughts once more, Daniel spotted something that made his heart leap with sudden hope. Fresh paw prints pressed clearly into a muddy section of trail, larger and more numerous than any wild animal tracks he had encountered before. He knelt down, examining the prints carefully, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. Whatever, or whoever, had made these tracks had passed through recently, and judging by the pattern, they were moving together as a coordinated group, exactly as Peter had described. Daniel rose slowly, his exhaustion forgotten entirely, replaced by a renewed determination that pushed him steadily forward, deeper into the remote valley that Peter had described, following a trail that might finally lead him back to the family he had lost so long ago. Daniel followed the fresh tracks for several hours, his pace quickening despite the rugged terrain slowing his progress. The paw prints occasionally disappeared where the ground grew rocky, or where fallen leaves obscured the trail, but he continued pressing forward, guided by instinct as much as by the physical evidence before him. By midday, he came across something that made him pause entirely, a small, neatly built structure, fashioned from woven branches and dried grass, clearly some kind of shelter, though far too small and simple to belong to a person. He knelt down to examine it closely, recognizing it immediately as a den, likely constructed or claimed by the pack he was tracking, used perhaps as a resting spot during their daily travels through this section of the forest. Encouraged by this discovery, Daniel continued onward, the trail growing steadily clearer as he moved deeper into the valley Peter had described. The forest around him began to change subtly, the trees growing older and taller, the underbrush less wild and tangled, almost as if this section of the woods had been tended, however lightly, by careful hands over many years. As afternoon light began slanting low through the canopy above, Daniel spotted smoke rising faintly in the distance, a thin gray column curling upward against the darkening sky. His heart raced at the sight. Someone lived out here, deep within this remote, seemingly forgotten section of the forest. He approached cautiously, uncertain what or who he might find. The smoke led him toward a small clearing, where a modest wooden cabin stood quietly beside a gently flowing stream. The structure looked weathered but well-maintained, a small garden visible along one side, though noticeably overgrown in places, as though recent care had been less consistent than in years past. Daniel paused at the edge of the clearing, studying the scene carefully. The cabin appeared empty, no movement visible through the windows, no sound of activity from within, yet the smoke continued rising steadily from the chimney, suggesting someone had tended the fire recently. He called out cautiously, his voice carrying uncertainly across the quiet clearing. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Silence greeted him, broken only by the gentle sound of the nearby stream and the rustling of leaves overhead. Daniel took several careful steps closer to the cabin, his earlier excitement now mixed with a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, a low growl sounded from somewhere near the tree line, causing Daniel to freeze in place. He turned slowly toward the sound, and there, emerging cautiously from the shadows of the surrounding forest, stood 5 dogs, positioned protectively in a loose formation, their eyes fixed intently on this unfamiliar visitor. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he studied the animals carefully. They were clearly healthy, well-fed, and remarkably coordinated in their protective stance, exactly as Peter had described. At the front of the group stood a large, confident male, his dark coat gleaming in the afternoon light, positioned protectively ahead of his siblings. Daniel raised his hands slowly, speaking in a calm, steady voice, careful not to make any sudden movements that might provoke the clearly protective pack. "Easy now," he said softly. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." The dogs remained cautious, though their growls softened slightly at the calm tone of his voice. Daniel's eyes moved carefully across each animal, searching for any sign of familiarity, any resemblance to the dog he had lost 2 years earlier. Then, from behind the protective line of younger dogs, an older female stepped forward slowly, her muzzle gray, her movements careful and deliberate with age. Daniel's entire body went still as he studied her closely. The shape of her ears, the particular pattern of dark fur along her back, the way she tilted her head slightly when uncertain, every detail matched the memories he had carried for 2 long years. "Sable?" he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief and overwhelming emotion. The old dog paused, her ears perking up slightly at the sound of her name, a name she had not heard spoken aloud in over 2 years. She took several cautious steps closer, sniffing the air carefully, her eyes studying Daniel's face with an intensity that suggested recognition slowly dawning within her. Daniel knelt down slowly, extending his hand carefully, tears already beginning to blur his vision. "It's me," he said softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's really me." Sable approached hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, until finally, she pressed her graying muzzle firmly against his outstretched palm, her tail beginning to wag slowly, uncertainly, as though testing a long-forgotten memory. Behind her, the younger dogs watched curiously, their earlier protective tension easing slightly, as they observed their mother's reaction to this unfamiliar visitor. Daniel remained kneeling, gently stroking Sable's graying fur, overwhelmed by emotions he had not allowed himself to fully feel in over 2 years. "You had puppies," he said softly, looking up at the 4 younger dogs watching him carefully from a respectful distance. "You had this whole family, and I never knew." As the initial shock and joy of the reunion began settling, Daniel's attention shifted back toward the quiet cabin, standing just beyond the clearing. Someone had clearly cared for Sable and her puppies throughout these past 2 years, someone who had fed them, sheltered them, and taught them the confident, coordinated behavior he had witnessed upon his arrival. He rose slowly, glancing toward the cabin's dark, silent windows, a new question forming urgently in his mind. Where was the person responsible for this remarkable transformation, and why, despite the clear signs of recent activity, did the cabin feel so completely, unsettlingly empty? Daniel approached the cabin slowly, Sable walking closely beside him, while her 4 grown puppies followed at a cautious distance, their earlier wariness gradually giving way to curious observation. He climbed the 2 wooden steps leading to the front door, noticing the careful craftsmanship of the porch railing, clearly built by someone with patience and skill. He knocked gently, though something in the stillness of the clearing already told him no one would answer. When silence greeted his knock, he pushed the door open carefully, calling out once more, his voice echoing softly through the small, quiet interior. The inside of the cabin told a story of a life lived simply but thoughtfully. Neat shelves lined one wall, filled with worn books and small carved wooden figures, likely crafted during long winter evenings. A rocking chair sat near a stone fireplace, a folded quilt draped over its arm, and a small writing desk stood beneath the single window, papers, and a well-used journal resting atop its surface. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, Sable following closely behind him, while the younger dogs remained hesitantly near the doorway, watching intently. He noticed immediately that the fireplace, though clearly used recently, now held only cold ashes, and a fine layer of dust had begun settling across the furniture, suggesting the cabin had been unattended for some time. He moved slowly toward the writing desk, his eyes drawn to the open journal resting there. Though it felt intrusive, some quiet instinct told him the answers he sought might be found within its pages. He picked it up carefully, beginning to read the neat, careful handwriting that filled page after page. The journal told the story of a woman named Ruth, who had come to these mountains many years earlier, seeking solitude, after losing both her husband and her son within the same devastating year. It described her quiet life of gardening, reading, and gentle reflection. And then, with clear excitement evident even through the careful handwriting, the arrival of an exhausted, pregnant dog during a fierce storm. Daniel's hands trembled as he continued reading, learning how Ruth had nursed Sable back to health, how she had helped deliver 5 healthy puppies in her small barn, and how she had spent the following 2 years raising and training this remarkable canine family with patient dedication and growing love. The final entries grew shorter, the handwriting slightly less steady, describing increasing episodes of chest pain and physical exhaustion that Ruth had chosen not to seek help for, given her remote isolation from any medical care. The very last entry, dated several weeks earlier, read simply, "The dogs will be fine without me. I've made certain of that. Whatever happens, I am grateful beyond words for the family they gave me these past 2 years." Daniel closed the journal slowly, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just read. He looked down at Sable, who sat quietly beside him, her expression somehow reflecting the same quiet sorrow he now felt deeply within his own chest. He continued exploring the small cabin carefully, eventually discovering, in a peaceful spot beneath a large oak tree just beyond the garden, a simple wooden marker, clearly handmade, bearing a name carved carefully into the wood, Ruth Calloway, along with dates marking a life that had spanned many decades, ending peacefully, just a few weeks before Daniel's arrival. Beside the modest grave, Daniel noticed something that brought fresh tears to his eyes, small paw prints pressed firmly into the soft earth surrounding the marker, evidence that the dogs had continued visiting this quiet spot regularly, refusing to abandon the woman who had cared for them so completely during her final years. He sat down slowly on the grass beside the grave, Sable resting her graying head gently against his knee, while the 4 younger dogs cautiously approached, settling nearby in a protective, mournful circle around the resting place of the woman who had raised them. Daniel remained there for a long while, processing the extraordinary story that had unfolded in this remote corner of the forest, completely unknown to him until this very day. Ruth had found Sable during the same storm that had taken her from him, had nursed her back to health, had helped bring 5 new lives safely into the world, and had spent 2 years pouring quiet, patient love into raising this family, all while facing her own declining health entirely alone, without complaint, without seeking help, and apparently without regret. As the afternoon light began softening into evening, Daniel rose slowly, looking down at the peaceful grave, then toward the 5 dogs watching him with quiet, trusting eyes. Whatever path had led him to this remote clearing, whatever combination of chance, instinct, and quiet hope had guided his journey, he understood now with complete certainty what he needed to do. He could not undo the loneliness Ruth had faced in her final days, nor could he change the quiet, solitary circumstances of her passing. But he could ensure that the remarkable family she had raised with such patient love would never again face uncertainty or neglect, carrying forward the gift of care and companionship that Ruth had given them during her final, unexpectedly joyful years. Daniel spent that first night at the cabin, unable to bring himself to leave so soon after everything he had discovered. He built a small fire in the old stone fireplace, and the dogs, seeming to sense the significance of his presence, gathered close around him, settling into the same comfortable positions Daniel imagined they once held beside Ruth, during countless similar evenings. He read through more of the journal that night, learning additional small details about the life Ruth had built in this remote corner of the forest. She had once lived near the edge of Fallbrook itself, working as a schoolteacher for many years before tragedy reshaped her entire existence. Her husband, a quiet carpenter named Walter, had passed away from a sudden illness, and less than a year later, her only son, a young man eager to become a forest ranger, had lost his life during a difficult mountain rescue attempt. The weight of losing both her husband and son within such a short span had driven Ruth to abandon her previous life entirely, choosing instead to disappear into these mountains, believing that solitude offered her only path toward survival. The journal entries from those early years reflected deep, unresolved grief, though gradually, as the years passed, her writing shifted toward quiet acceptance and a hard-won peace with her isolated existence. Reading these entries, Daniel began to understand more fully the profound significance Sable's arrival must have held for Ruth. After years of carefully guarded solitude, this exhausted, pregnant dog had unknowingly reopened a door Ruth believed permanently closed, inviting connection, responsibility, and unconditional love back into a life that had long ago abandoned such possibilities. The following morning, Daniel made the difficult decision to begin the long journey back toward Fallbrook, bringing Sable and her 4 grown puppies with him. The dogs, though initially hesitant to leave the only home they had ever known, seemed to sense something reassuring in Daniel's calm, confident presence, gradually falling into step behind him as he began the journey back through the forest. It took nearly 3 full days to complete the return journey, considerably longer than his initial trip, given the need to accommodate the pace of 5 dogs unfamiliar with such extensive travel. Along the way, Daniel found himself continually amazed by the pack's remarkable behavior, their coordinated movements, their gentle protectiveness toward one another, and their calm, confident demeanor, even when facing unfamiliar terrain. Upon finally reaching Fallbrook, Daniel immediately sought out Laura at the general store, eager to share the extraordinary story he had uncovered. Laura listened with growing astonishment, occasionally pressing a hand to her chest, as Daniel described Ruth's quiet, solitary years in the forest, and the remarkable family she had raised there, completely unknown to anyone in town. "I remember Ruth," Laura said softly, her eyes distant with memory. "She used to teach at the schoolhouse years ago, before everything happened with her husband and son. Folks always wondered what became of her after she left town. Some said she'd moved away entirely. No one imagined she'd stayed so close, living quietly out there all these years." Word of Daniel's discovery spread quickly through the small community, many older residents recalling fond memories of Ruth's years as a beloved schoolteacher, remembering her patience, her gentle humor, and her deep love for the natural world that had eventually become her final, quiet sanctuary. Henry, upon hearing the full story, insisted on helping Daniel arrange a proper memorial for Ruth, one that might finally give her the recognition and quiet honor she deserved after years of unacknowledged sacrifice and hidden kindness. Together with several other members of the community, they organized a small gathering at the schoolhouse where Ruth had once taught, inviting former students and old friends to share memories and celebrate the life she had lived, both before and during her years of solitude. During this gathering, Daniel shared the full story of Sable's disappearance, Ruth's unexpected discovery and care, and the remarkable family of dogs that now stood as living proof of the quiet, patient love Ruth had continued sharing with the world, even in her most isolated years. Many attendees were moved to tears, recognizing in this story the same gentle, nurturing spirit that had defined Ruth's years as a teacher, now revealed to have continued flourishing quietly within the depths of the forest. Following the memorial, Daniel made a decision that would honor Ruth's memory in a lasting, meaningful way. He began making arrangements to establish a small sanctuary near the edge of town, dedicated to caring for abandoned or lost animals, drawing inspiration directly from the compassionate care Ruth had shown toward Sable and her puppies during their 2 years together in the forest. The sanctuary, modest in its beginnings, quickly gained support from the local community, many residents eager to contribute time, resources, and personal stories of animals they had rescued or cared for over the years. Daniel dedicated the space formally in Ruth's honor, ensuring her quiet, unacknowledged kindness would finally receive the recognition it had long deserved. Months passed, and the small sanctuary Daniel established near Fallbrook grew steadily, becoming a cherished gathering place for the entire community. Sable, now noticeably slower with age but content and well cared for, spent her days resting comfortably in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by familiar faces and the constant gentle attention of townsfolk who had come to know her remarkable story. Birch, Wren, Fern, Moss, and Clay adjusted remarkably well to their new surroundings, their confident, well-trained behavior making them beloved figures throughout the community. Birch quickly became known for his gentle patience with children visiting the sanctuary, while Wren remained closely bonded to Daniel, often accompanying him during his daily rounds, much as she once had with Ruth. Fern and Moss continued their playful partnership, delighting visitors with their energetic antics, while Clay found a quiet, comfortable role helping care for injured or frightened animals brought to the sanctuary, his calm, patient nature proving invaluable in soothing anxious new arrivals. Daniel often returned to the remote cabin deep in the forest, making the journey every few months to tend Ruth's grave and maintain the small garden she had once cared for so lovingly. He found a quiet peace in these visits, sitting beside her resting place, sharing updates about the dogs' new lives, and expressing gratitude for the remarkable gift she had given, both to Sable and her puppies, and indirectly, to himself. During one such visit, nearly a year after his initial discovery, Daniel brought along a small group of visitors from Fallbrook, including several children who had grown especially fond of the sanctuary dogs. Standing together beside Ruth's peaceful resting place, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the forest she had called home for so many years, Daniel shared her story once more, ensuring her memory would continue living on through each new generation who visited this remote, sacred place. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with wonder, at the story of a woman who had found unexpected joy and purpose in caring for a lost, pregnant dog and her puppies, transforming her own quiet grief into 2 years of patient, selfless love. As they prepared to leave, one young girl knelt beside the simple wooden marker, gently placing a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered along the trail. "Thank you for taking care of them," she whispered softly, echoing sentiments that Daniel himself had repeated countless times during his own visits. As the sanctuary continued growing over the following years, Daniel made sure Ruth's story remained central to its identity, often sharing it with new volunteers, visitors, and animals' adoptive families, ensuring her quiet legacy of compassion continued inspiring others long after her passing. He commissioned a small plaque near the sanctuary's entrance, describing briefly the remarkable story of Ruth's 2 years raising Sable and her puppies alone in the forest, a permanent reminder of the profound impact one person's quiet kindness could have, even in the most isolated circumstances. Sable lived out her remaining years peacefully at the sanctuary, surrounded by her grown puppies and the loving attention of the community that had come to cherish her remarkable story. When she eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep, nearly 3 years after Daniel's discovery, the entire town gathered to honor her memory, burying her gently beside a small memorial garden, established specifically to commemorate the animals who had touched the community's hearts throughout the sanctuary's growing history. Birch, wren, fern, moss, and clay continued living happy, fulfilled lives at the sanctuary, each eventually finding their own special role within the growing community, whether comforting frightened new arrivals, assisting with sanctuary tours, or simply providing companionship to visitors seeking connection with animals who carried such a remarkable story of resilience and love. Years later, when people asked Daniel about the sanctuary's origins, he would often share the story of that stormy night so long ago, the painful loss of his beloved dog, the years of quiet hope he had carried, and the extraordinary discovery that awaited him deep within the forest. A woman named Ruth, who had transformed her own profound grief into 2 years of selfless, patient love, raising a family of dogs entirely alone, asking for nothing in return, except the quiet companionship and purpose they had given her during her final years. Though Ruth never lived to see the sanctuary established in her honor, or the countless animals and families who would benefit from the compassionate legacy she unknowingly inspired, her spirit continued living on through every dog cared for, every child taught to love and respect animals, and every visitor moved by the remarkable story of a woman who found unexpected joy and purpose in the depths of an isolated forest, giving everything she had to a family that was never truly hers, yet loved as completely and unconditionally as if it had been her own from the very beginning. And so, in the quiet hills surrounding Fallbrook, Ruth's memory lived on, not as a story of loss or tragedy, but as a lasting celebration of the profound, transformative power of compassion, patience, and unconditional love, a gift she gave freely to a family of dogs who needed her, and who in turn gave her back a purpose and joy she had long believed impossible to find again.